Don't you hate videos showing you how to do a moon landing, but then use tech that you are nowhere near unlocking? Well, I gotta be honest, I'm guilty of that one too, but I will be making that up with this video where I will be building a crude moon lander using technology that is still fairly low on the tech tree to satisfy the contract, plant a flag on the moon. Despite the low tech, you should find this rocket easy to fly, and it holds enough fuel for you to comfortably complete the mission. Along with performing the mission, I will be providing some tips for using the KERBAL's EVA Pack on the surface of the moon. Let's get started. And there's actually 3 contracts we're going to be satisfying here. We have plant a flag on the moon, where the requirements are, well, just to plant a flag on the moon. But that does mean you need to have a KERBAL along, because only KERBALs can plant flags. We also have explore the moon, and the objective here is we have enough data on the moon to attempt a landing. We could stage one, it's up to you, but the only objective is to land on the moon. And then finally, always grab these easy ones, science data from the surface of the moon to transmit or recover some science data from the surface of the moon. We're going to be on the surface of the moon, so easy peasy. So those 3 are going to be what we're going to be doing. Taking a look at my current tech level, well, if you've been watching any of the last few episodes, this is going to be pretty familiar. Tier 2 vehicle assembly building, Tier 2 mission control, Tier 2 tracking station, Tier 2 launch pad, and Tier 2 astronaut complex. I want to keep the tech level to a minimum, to something that you might be around when you are attempting your first moon landing. And speaking of which, looking at the tech tree, we are completed up to the end of Tier 4. I do have a few Tier 5 nodes that I'm going to be taking advantage of. I have electrics. I want the solar panels and the Octo probe core. I also have advanced flight control. From that, I'm going to be using the advanced inline stabilizers. And I'm also going to be taking advantage of advanced construction. Mostly I am looking at this part right here, the TVR-1180C Mark I stack tricoupler. Yeah, just a structural part that'll help us build a bigger rocket. I have another node up here that I do have unlocked, but I'm not taking advantage of any of the parts in there, so we don't need to worry about that. Again, I do have the science to start unlocking more. I'm just not going to, because I want to keep the tech level low. If you happen to be beyond this tech level, well, this build could be even easier for you. Now, the one building I am going to upgrade is research and development. It is currently at level 1, and it cost me 451,000 KERBucks to upgrade, a pretty expensive upgrade. But upgrading it allows me, number 1, to be able to research further down the tech tree, but primarily I'm doing it because it'll allow KERBALs on EVAs to collect surface samples, which is a lot more science, and we're going to be on the surface of the moon, so I'm going to want that. So a level 2 research and development center has entered in. Okay, let's get started with our build. I've actually in this series gone to the moon a few times. I have a how to land on the moon video, but that video involved a separate lander and command vessel that were each launched individually and rendezvoused around the moon, and then the lander went down and the command vessel went down. So a much more complicated mission than what I'm going to be doing here. Also, the issue with that mission is often the Explore the Moon contract has a requirement that the vessel that lands on the moon needs to come back to Kerbin. Be on the lookout for that one. So that means that kind of Apollo style, separate command vessel, separate lander type of thing just doesn't work. I also did another mission where I landed a more capable moon vessel that was able to take many more KERBALs there. That requires tech that's later in the tech tree, so I deliberately want to do one that's lower on the tech tree. We're only going to send a single KERBAL there, but is more representative of what probably I would do in my own career games when it comes to my first moon landing. So we're going to start off with the Mark I command capsule. We're going to put on the Mark 16 parachute, as well, of course, as the 1.25 meter heat shield. That is the part that's going to be landing on the surface of the moon and returning back to Kerbin, in case you do have that requirement in the Explore the Moon contract to bring the vessel back to Kerbin's surface. Now we're going to need to construct some sort of service module with all of our science on it. This is going to be a big sciencey mission, so a TD-12 decoupler, a 1.25 meter service bay, our pilot is actually going to be a scientist, so I want to have some flight control, so we're going to put in the Octo probe core, and I'm also going to slide in there for a little bit of electricity, the Z200 battery, and for communication, a Communitron 16 antenna. And we're going to want to put on all of the science that we have available, so that's going to include the Science Junior, a Mystery Goo, and a thermometer and barometer. And I'm putting all the science near to the hatch because one of the things we're going to have to be cognizant of is being able to collect that science with our scientists when we're on the surface of the moon. I do not have any ladder parts unlocked yet. That's a technology that is too sophisticated for our Kerbals at this point. So I positioned all of this science so that we can actually access it just from hanging onto the hatch here. Now we're going to need to think about propulsion, and for that we're going to need a Delta V budget. So the way I like to build my more simple moon missions is to imagine this thing sitting on the surface of the moon. What do I need to get it back to Kerbin? Well, according to the Delta V map, to get off the surface of the moon back to low orbit about the moon is 580 meters per second. But personally, I find this number pretty tight, especially for a tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 25% to that to get it up to 725 meters per second. Then, to break out of low orbit about the moon and to get back towards Kerbin is 280 meters per second. And remember, we don't have to worry about the 860 that you see here because we'll be putting ourselves into Kerbin's atmosphere and using the atmosphere to slow us down enough to get down to the surface. So if we add that all up, that comes out to be 1005 meters per second. But this thing is also going to have to do a little bit of the landing too, and so you want to add on to that at least another 100 meters per second. So we're looking at something at least 1,105 meters per second. And the other thing you want to do is with landers, the wider you can make the base of the lander, the less likely it is for you to tip over. So I also want to make this thing wide. So here's what I ended up doing. I ended up going and grabbing an Oscar B fuel can, putting it on three-way symmetry, and just putting 3 of them on there like that, and then I copied that and put another 3 on top, so a total of 6 of those Oscar B fuel cans. And for propulsion, I just grabbed the Terrier liquid fuel engine and stuck that underneath. And if we go over down here, make sure this is in vacuum, you can see that's 1,369 meters per second. Still got more stuff to add on to this, but you can see that this is already a pretty healthy Delta V compared to our budget. So let's add on more. Well, first of all, we are going to need to land, so we're going to need some landing gear. The only ones I've got unlocked so far are these small LT-05 micro landing struts. They're pretty small, so when you put them on, make sure that they do extend below the engine bell. So I'm actually going to grab this with the move tool, take the snap off, and I'm going to slide these down like so that they are a little bit below the engine bell. I also find that the springs and the dampeners on these tend to be a little bit too springy, a little bit too spongy for my taste. So I like to get in here, look at the spring dampener and take it off of auto. That gives you a couple of these extra bars. If you're not seeing this option, make sure that you do have advanced tweakables turned on your settings. And what I like to do is crank up the spring strength and the dampener strength. Exactly where you put these bars really doesn't make a huge difference. Just make them a healthy degree higher than where they are as a default. And we do want some solar generation as well. For that, we're going to grab some Oxstat solar panels. I'm going to slide these in around here, and we're going to just slide them up a little bit, and then we're going to grab this rotation tool. We're going to rotate them to about 45 degrees. And then we're going to slide these in so it looks like they're kind of sitting against both the fuel cans and against the side of the rocket. And then finally, it's nice to put on some landing lights. It helps you judge the distance to the ground. So down here under utility, I'm going to grab me some Mark 1 illuminators. And the thing that I like to do with my landing lights is I like to get into the action groups, go to the light action groups, find the Mark 1 illuminators that I just put in, take them out of the light action group, and put them instead into the gear action group. So we'll go there, and then we'll toggle on the lights. And what that means is when I toggle the landing gear, these lights come on automatically. That's the only time I need them, is when the landing gear is deployed, and that way they toggle together. I find that a nice way to do it. And after doing a little bit of texturing and adding on some obligatory lights, I end up with a delta V of 1,318 meters per second and a thrust to weight ratio of 1.64 on Kerbin's surface. Now, often I get comments on this part, why are you looking at Kerbin's thrust to weight ratio? Shouldn't you be switching this to the moon, where the thrust to weight ratio is 9.91? Yeah, technically, you actually only need a thrust to weight ratio over 1 that's on the moon. So you might be thinking, this is real overkill. But I find this number is deceptive. If you keep it on Kerbin all the time, this tells you how many G's, and by G's I mean how many times 9.8 meters per second squared you can accelerate at. And that to me is a very comfortable and familiar unit. If I switch this to the moon and see this 9.91, how quickly does this vessel accelerate or decelerate? I find it hard to kind of tell from that number. And while you are falling towards the surface, having a good idea of how quickly your vessel will decelerate and being comfortable with that rate of deceleration is a useful thing to have. So I personally always leave this on Kerbin, always make sure that this TWR, if I'm doing a moon landing, is over 1, so that I have an acceleration of the vessel that's something I'm used to. I'm not suddenly coming towards the surface and finding I can't slow down fast enough. That's me. If you want us to do the moon, go ahead, but that's the way I like to do it. But anyway, what we ended up with here is this is our lander. It can do the last part of the landing and get itself back to Kerbin, no problem at all. Now what we need to do is get it down to the surface. So for that, again, I'm going to need a budget. If I go back and take a look at the budget that takes me from the surface of the moon to Kerbin's surface, that is 1,005 meters per second. Now let's add on the numbers that gets it there. So if I imagine myself in low orbit about Kerbin, it's 860 meters per second to get myself my moon intercept, 280 meters per second for the capture about the moon. Again, it says 580 for the landing, but that is really tight. I find even personally it is super tight. And what I'm going to do for the purposes of this tutorial is add on 50% to that number so that you have lots of fuel in which to perform your landing. So I'm going to jack that up to 870 meters per second. That gives me a total of 3,015 meters per second, but as you are probably used to if you've been watching any of my tutorials, I like this vessel to also deal with the upper part of my Kerbin orbital insertion, so I like to add on about another 1,000 meters per second to bring the total delta V budget I have to get myself from the Kerbin's upper atmosphere and do the whole rest of the mission to 4,015 meters per second. So what I'm just going to do is put a dummy stage under this. No command vessel, no nothing, just another stage that I will ditch before I land, and it will crash onto the surface of the moon. The other thing I'm not going to do is enclose this within a fairing. Now usually when I do these kind of things, I get people that get upset with me. They're concerned about the drag of pushing this up through the atmosphere. If you are building a single stage to orbit spaceplane, yes, drag is a big deal, but for rockets it's not. You spend so little time in the lower part of the atmosphere, and you're not going nearly as fast as you would with something like a space plane in the lower part of the atmosphere. It doesn't matter. And once you're up into the upper part of the atmosphere, so let's say above 50 kilometers, drag isn't a deal at all, and you're only going to take you about a minute to a minute and a half to get yourself to that point. So instead of worrying and fussing about drag, aerodynamic stability is a different thing, and we'll talk about that, but drag itself, don't worry about it. Put on a little bit of extra fuel, that's not a big deal. A bigger deal is actually making sure you keep the weight of these payloads as low as you can. So don't worry so much about drag. I'm just going to leave this exactly the way it is. So let's bring our budget up to, again, about 4,015 meters per second. I'm going to do that with a TD-12 decoupler, underneath which is going to go a set of the advanced inline stabilizers, because this is going to be a bigger kind of a rocket. I want the extra reaction wheels. And then we're going to go bigger than we've ever gone before. I'm going to go into structural, and I'm going to grab the TVR-1180C Mark I stack tricoupler, and I'm going to do a little bit, I'm going to just rotate it like that. I find that just looks a little better as it's going up through the atmosphere. And then under that, we're going to put 3 FL-T 200 fuel cans and 3 FL-T 400 fuel cans. And then underneath all of that is going to go the LV909 Terrier liquid fuel engine. And if I play a little bit with the staging here, you can see that I got myself a healthy Delta V. Now, the one thing with when you use the tri-coupler is that although these things are attached very well at the top, they're going to be floppy down here at the bottom. There's nothing actually holding all this together. So whenever you use the tri-coupler, you want to get yourself some struts. Go to make sure you're on 3-way symmetry and just put some small little struts just connecting these bottom tanks together here at the bottom. And if we take a look over here, we can see that we have a total of 4,175 meters per second, thrust to weight ratio of 1.16. That's going to do us just fine. All we got left now is to put on our lifter. And again, I'm going to budget for the purposes of this tutorial 3,800 meters per second for the lifter. And if I add that to the 3,115 meters per second, that is for the mission budget, that gives me a total Delta V budget of 6,815 meters per second. Might even go a little bit more than that just to overcome the bit of drag that's up here at the top. And we're going to do that with a trio of TD-12 decouplers on the bottom of these Terriers, 3 FL-T 200 fuel cans, and then a total of 12 FL-T 400 fuel cans. So that's 3, 6, 9, and 12. And then underneath all of that, we're going to go with our LV-T45 swivel liquid fuel engines. Again, this is going to be very floppy, not only here, but actually here as well, near where the decouplers are, because this whole tower is not connected to each other. So definitely grab yourself some struts, join them down here at the bottom, but also, I don't know, somewhere around the middle here as well. You're going to want to join them. So this tower of tanks are actually strutted in 3 places. Now, I mentioned that drag doesn't bother me too much, so I'm not going to worry too much about the drag of this rocket because of these things up here, but having a lot of drag up top tends to add some aerodynamic instability to the rocket. It tends to bring the center of drag forward, which has a tendency to sometimes cause your rocket to flip over. And that isn't always reflected when you put on the aerodynamic overlay, this blue and black ball. That's actually not showing you anything that's remotely right, and sometimes you can only figure this out through testing. And typically I've been using the basic fins on my rocket so far, but I'm going to step it up to the AV-T1 winglets, and I'm going to put 3 of them down here at the bottom like that to really pull that center of drag down and make this rocket more stable as it flies up through the atmosphere. I could also go with a more controllable surface like the AV-R8 winglet or the Delta Deluxe winglet. These guys have control surfaces on them, but I'm not going to do that. We have plenty of attitude control with the gimbal swivel engines that are down here, so I'm going to leave these just as the static winglets. Now, we're not quite there on the Delta V front, so I'm going to add on some radial boosters. I'm going to start with the TT-38 radial decouplers. We're going to put them a little bit kind of towards the side here a little bit, so our boosters will fit in here. And this time I am going to go with some SRBs rather than making liquid fuel boosters, because I actually really want the extra thrust. We're going to go with the BACC Thumper solid fuel boosters, which are the biggest ones I have so far. We're going to put on 3 of them. There we go, just like so. And on top of that, we're going to put on a bit of a nose cone just on the top like that. Now, these boosters do not have any gimbaling, so attitude control is going to be a little bit tricky. So to give ourselves some gimbaling control, what we're going to do is we're going to take these swivel engines and we're going to pull them down with the boosters so that all 6 of these engines will all take off at launch. We're going to check here our staging. That's good, that's good, that's good, and that's good. That gives us a very, very high launch thrust to weight ratio, so we're going to turn down the thrust limiter on our boosters, and I found that 63% gave me a launch thrust to weight ratio of 1.34, and a total vacuum delta V of 6,977. This should do very nicely. Now, I want to get these boosters to come off cleanly. I do not have any Separatrons unlocked yet, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the move tool, take the snap off. We're going to slide these down so that the couplers are high up on the boosters, and then I'm going to move the decouplers so that the engine bells of the SRBs are a little bit below the engine bells of the swivel engines. And after a little bit of retexturing and the addition of some launch clamps, we were ready to go. Now remember, what we want is not a pilot in our command capsule, but rather a scientist so that they can work all of that science equipment. So we're going to remove Jebediah. We're going to put in Bob Kerman. He's going to be our first Kerbal to land on the moon's surface. So let's go. This mission should be a big science haul for you, so make sure to grab science at every opportunity, especially from the Science Junior and Mystery Goo, as it takes several collections before you actually have it all. And if you're struggling collecting science and getting to where I am on the tech tree, then this video here should get you going in the right direction. Though this rocket is bigger than what you've seen from me in the last few videos, you still fly it to orbit in exactly the same way. If you need more details on that, I would recommend this video here. Once in orbit, set the moon as a target and use a maneuver node to set up the injection burn, which is typically between 850 and 860 meters per second. Don't be above this or you'll jack up the cost of your capture too. I like to come in pretty close to the moon, about 15 kilometers or so on my closest approach. And although this part doesn't matter too much, I like to come in so I orbit the moon in a prograde direction. That's counterclockwise when viewed from above. Once in the moon's sphere of influence, use another maneuver node to set up your capture burn into a roughly circular orbit. This will be our parking orbit from which to plan our descent to the surface. If this is your first time in orbit about the moon, do make sure to collect lots of EVA reports. I've actually already been in orbit, not just an orbit, but a polar orbit about the moon, and actually have gotten EVA reports, I think, over pretty much every biome. So there's not much here for me to collect, but before you go for your landing, do make sure that you get all the science that you can. As far as the descent goes, start by picking a landing area on the day side that looks relatively flat. I'm going to go for this large crater over here. Then burn retrograde at a low throttle about 1/4 to 1/3 of an orbit ahead of your landing area. And we want to watch over that you don't come. Just looking, I am coming pretty close to the terrain there, so I think that's about as much retrograde as I'm going to do until I'm actually a lot closer, because you want to make sure you do clear the terrain as you make your way over there. And preparing now for our lander, you want to put your view onto free so that the surface of the moon is below you. You want to put this on terrain, your speed reference to surface, and you want to roll the vessel so that blue is up on the nav ball. That will make everything easier as far as your orientation as you go down. Okay, we are coming up now onto this crater here. Orient this onto the retrograde vector. Looks a little lumpy coming up right away, so let's sort of clear this first half of the crater. Again, we can now give ourselves a little bit more retrograde, take some of this more of this speed off. That feels good about there. And start thinking about coming down for a landing. I'm going to extend our landing gear, get ready for that. And sort of look ahead, and we're looking for somewhere relatively flat. Now let's clear this big crater here, kind of looking at this far side. It looks like it's starting to get pretty hilly again, so why don't we start taking off some speed right now. So I'm going to put this right on the horizon, give ourselves lots of throttle, kind of looking maybe in around this zone here before we get up into that area. So really watching that retrograde vector. That's giving you an indication of how quickly you're falling. Right now, it's mostly horizontal, but as it moves up, more of that speed is turning towards vertical. I'm going to cut it there, because I do want to drift a little bit more horizontally and get above this zone here. And again, quick save is your friend. You don't hesitate to practice. Do yourself a quick save in a safe location, and then if you need to, come on back. There is plenty of fuel in this lander. If you feel like you need to carry yourself a little bit further horizontally, just point the vessel up and give a little bit of a burn to take away some of that vertical velocity so that you'll go further along horizontally. I think I'm doing pretty good. Back this way again. A little bit more into this zone. The more you pitch up, the more vertical velocity you're removing. I think actually anywhere down here is going to be pretty good. So let's push that retrograde vector up pretty high. Now I have a lot of fuel still in this stage. If you find yourself actually staging this one, don't worry about it. Again, I'm going to point vertical, give myself a little bit more altitude. This thing is built to be easy. Okay, let's actually take out all of my velocity here. I'm going to actually zero it right out, and we're going to stage this guy. Then I'm going to intentionally push a little bit to the side so I don't go on top of it. We are pretty close. We're only 160 meters and counting. Let's give a little bit of throttle here. And some people like to put on the cap lock, which turns those indicators blue. Wow, there we go. There we are. Lots of explosions going on back there. But either way, we are down. And this being my first time on the surface of the moon in this campaign, there is a mountain of science to collect. All of which, including the surface EVA report and surface sample, can be collected while hanging on to the capsule. But I do have a contract to plant a flag. For that, I need to put Bob's boots on the ground. Remember, this lander does not have a ladder, so the only way back to the hatch is via the EVA pack on Bob's back. If you are new to EVAing on the surface of the moon, or if you happen to be on Minmus doing the same thing, I would recommend at this point doing yourself a quick save so that you can, if things go really, really badly, revert back to this safe location. But let's EVA Bob, and we're going to let go. We're going to push R to activate our RCS, and we're going to go down here to the surface. Push R again to take it off, and we're going to plant our flag. This isn't a bad opportunity for you to practice using the RCS feature and moving around upon the surface of the moon. Remember, we did do a quick save, so if we need to, we can get ourselves back to a safe location. The thing you really want to watch is you want to watch your EVA propellant. There is a limited supply of that. Now, this will automatically refill every time you go back into the capsule, but if you run out while you're outside of the capsule, then you're going to be limited to just, walking and jumping. But let's put on RCS, and we're going to hold the left shift key, and we're going to go up. And what you want to do first, you just want to practice sort of what does it take to kind of just hover in the same spot. Get used to that, tapping on the left shift key to what it takes to get into the same spot. Now, the other thing you can do is push the W key and move yourself forward and practice just moving forward in a straight line. Now, look at the prograde vector here. You can get an idea of whether it's above or below the horizon, whether you are going up or whether you are going down. Of course, you can also look at your vertical speed indicator. So practice kind of traversing horizontally like this, all the while, of course, watching that EVA propellant. And if you're lucky, maybe you can find another biome to get yourself into. I do not believe there are any other biomes for me near here, so I'm going to turn around and head back. And you might find yourself doing a bit of a face plant. Usually that's not too detrimental, but if it is, again, that's what the quick save was for. So let's start moving forward, give ourselves a little bit of speed. Remember, as much speed as you give yourself, you're going to need to take that off again, and that uses monopropellant, so probably not too much speed. We're moving along horizontally, just by watching that prograde vector. And then as we come in towards our capsule, we're going to put on the brakes with the S key. Slow ourselves down. Let's see if we can not get ourselves right back to the hatch. The other thing you can do if you want is practice just going around the capsule. And it does take a little bit of practice, but you'll find after a little bit, you'll get pretty comfortable with this. And it's a useful skill to have. All right, let's go inside and get ourselves ready to head back. All right, time to get ourselves back. So SAS back on. You want to look at your nav ball. Look where the east direction is. That is 90 degrees on the nav ball. That is that way. You may, I think it's that way, but I'm not 100% sure. But look at your nav ball, and then what you want to do is you want to, here, let's take the fine control off. We're going to throttle up. Pretty much full throttle, and then we're going to pitch over on that east, and we're going to go right over. Pitch over hard. Make sure that you don't crash into any terrain, but otherwise you want to pitch over pretty much as hard as you can, and we're going to keep going over very close to the horizon till our apoapsis gets around, I don't know, around 15 kilometers or so, I suppose. And the reason why you pitch over so hard is because, well, there isn't an atmosphere to slow you down, so you don't have to do any of that kind of aerodynamic gravity turn type of stuff. Orbits are all about getting horizontal velocity, so you want to get that horizontal velocity basically as quickly as you can. And after circularizing at apoapsis, it was time to head home. For the return burn, you want to place the maneuver so that your ejection from the moon's SOI is in a retrograde direction relative to the moon's orbit about Kerbin. I always go for a periapsis with Kerbin of about 35 kilometers, which is well into Kerbin's atmosphere. And while Bob performs this final burn of the mission, why don't I go over the main takeaways from this episode? Most of this episode was focused on the building of a relatively low-tech moon mission. In particular, building a lander capable of getting itself from the surface of the moon back to Kerbin, and then building a rocket capable of getting that lander from Kerbin to the surface of the moon. I also looked at how to perform a powered landing, after which I spent some time talking about the utility of using a KERBAL's EVA Pack while on the surface of the moon. And with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. Join me next week when I'll be looking at how to design and deploy a rover onto the surface of Minmus. I hope to see you then.